Well, welcome, Dr. Perlmutter. It's a real pleasure to have you today, and I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk about your new book called Brainwash, which I see is right behind you at the back there, if you want to hold it
And
up
right
so
next to me,
everyone
I
can
might
see it.
add. I have it right
Okay,
here. Keep
go
a copy
ahead.
at the ready. You never know during an interview.
Great. Well, it's a real pleasure to have you here, and I'd love you to just start by sharing what makes this book different from your other amazing books that you've written.
It's a very good question. And I would tell you that most of my writing, if not all of my writing, has been kind of advice to achieve a goal as it relates to making certain lifestyle choices. In other words, what you should eat, how much exercise to get, what is the value of dietary fat, much like many of the other books that are out there. And to be sure, there are a lot of terrific books out there by my colleagues that you've interviewed, and they write terrific books, but they're all useless. They're totally useless unless you're able to implement what they're talking about. My books as well. Unless you're able to follow the plan, these books turn out to be useless. So what we began investigating, my son and myself, Austin is an internal medicine specialist. We first talked about our frustration being physicians and how we would make recommendations to patients, giving them what we think is good advice, and yet about 80% of the time they wouldn't follow the advice. And we realized that we're kind of blaming them, that they couldn't follow through. And society even tends to blame people who make bad choices. But we began to investigate the actual process of making that choice. We learned that our decision-making ability, our brain's ability to make a good decision that thinks about the long term, has been hacked by modern society. That our exposure to the digital world, our lack of sleep, our lack of nature exposure, lack of exercise, etc., tend to hack into our brains and lock us into much more impulsive decision making that doesn't think about the long term as far as we are concerned, doesn't think about the long term as far as other people are concerned. We call that empathy. Doesn't think about the effects on the planet. So that became the focus of Brainwash, to really call out how our modern world is hacking into our decision making and then to make things right again.
And so why is this message important, other than you talk about not being able to follow through on recommendations in a book, for example? What are there some other reasons why this might be important?
Well, it's basically an existential discussion that the survival of humans is dependent upon our ability to make good decisions, our ability to plan for the future. When we recognize that all of these hacks that have been perpetrated upon us, like, the addition of sugar to 68% of the food sold in the grocery store here in America, the emphasis on not getting enough sleep, how our lives have been disrupted by how our brains are hacked by our digital experiences, for example, how that changes our decision-making towards a more self-centered, fear-based, us versus them, short-term gratification kind of model, and away from thinking of the long term as it relates to our own health, as it relates to the health of our planet, then it becomes a very big deal indeed. That the spread, for example, of the Western diet around the globe influences our decision-making not in a favorable way. That emphasis on achievement and staying up late to do things at night and to wake up early so you can get ahead actually is a disservice to us, locks us into more functioning from the amygdala part of the brain, as opposed to the prefrontal cortex, and that locks us into more self-centered, short-sighted decisions that are detrimental for ourselves, detrimental for our neighbors, our communities, and detrimental for everyone on the planet. So it has a big, big implication. What is influencing our brain's hardwiring by the food we eat, by what we see, and how our brains are hacked on our digital experiences has a huge impact on the future of humanity. So yes, there's a lot more to consider here.
Global implications. Wow, that's yeah, really scary. So I'm going to read a quote from the book, which I think was very profound. You say our brain's performance is being gravely manipulated, resulting in behaviors that leave us more lonely, anxious, depressed, distrustful, illness prone, and overweight than ever before. At the same time, we feel disconnected from ourselves, from others, and from the world at large. And you've alluded to a little bit of that already, but can you tell us a little bit more about this term that you use in the book called disconnection syndrome?
Well, there's a figurative and a literal translation or definition of disconnection syndrome. The literal usage of disconnection syndrome is the disconnection that's happening in our brains from the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain that helps us be empathetic and compassionate, forward thinking, caring for ourselves and the planet type of decision making. And when we disconnect from that, we tend to rely on more primitive areas of the brain that are less concerned about the health and well-being of other people, that are less concerned about what the future of this planet might be like, that are less concerned about our moment-to-moment decision making. So that's what disconnection syndrome is all about. We talk about how the prefrontal cortex, through its connection to other areas like the amygdala, exerts what's called a top-down control, basically reining in impulsive decisions, basically serving as the adult in the room so that we can behave more rationally, more thoughtfully. When we disconnect from the prefrontal cortex, that's what disconnection syndrome is all about, then the manifestations are bad decisions, acting impulsively, acting not in the interest of other people or the interest of ourselves, our future selves, or the interest of our planet, for example. So that's what disconnection is all about. But the manifestations are, in the more literal sense, that we are disconnected from each other. We are really disconnected. We're becoming lonelier and lonelier despite this thing that's called social media. So it's not, and there's nothing really social about it in general, though there is an upside to social media if used appropriately. But by and large, our digital experiences are tending to make us much more isolated. And feelings of loneliness, sense of loneliness, is a powerful threat to health. It is associated with increased risk of chronic degenerative conditions, including heart disease and cancer. So we've really got to welcome back the notion of reconnecting to the prefrontal cortex on the one hand, and to each other on the other hand, because we need each other. We need to recognize that we're all in this together. And the more we allow ourselves to be hacked by the pop-up ads and the clickbait and the YouTube videos that are queued up one after the next, by the very powerfully inflammatory foods that we consume, by our lack of sleep and exercise and exposure to nature, the more of those experiences that we have, the more we disconnect, the more we foster disconnection syndrome, and the more detrimental it is, not only for my health, but for your health and for the health of everyone around us.
So you talked about the YouTube videos, one after the other, and the pop-up ads, and you've got a great chapter in the book called High-Tech Hijack. And a lot of us know intuitively that there's this, that we're addicted to the internet, or that we're spending too much time, or that we're using the internet mindlessly. But you share some pretty alarming stats. And I think when you read some of these stats, it really brings it home. Like you talk about how...
They're very worrisome statistics. You're right. 6% of the global population has been characterized with internet addiction. That is 250 million people. That's 5 times the population of Great Britain. So that's a very worrisome statistic. Indeed, Americans spend about 40 to 42% of their waking hours looking at one screen or another, whether it's their tablet, phone, television, or computer. That adds up over a lifetime to about 22 years of screen time. That has its detrimental possibilities just directly, but also it's been said that when you're doing one thing, you're not doing something else. So when you're spending countless hours on the internet mindlessly, you're not in nature. You're not connecting to people in real time. You're not exercising. You're not shopping for good food and preparing meals. So it's a threat. And now we are not anti-technology. Look, Trudy, you and I right now are leveraging technology to have this wonderful conversation. We wrote the book based upon an unlimited resource of information available to us on the internet. So it's about using these assets appropriately. We developed an idea that our time on the internet, for example, or any screen time for that matter, should pass the test of time, T-I-M-E, T. How much time are we dedicating for that activity? I, is that time we're spending on the internet, for example, intentional? Do we have a goal? M, is it mindful? Are we aware while we're exploring whatever it is that we've dedicated our time to explore? Are we mindful of what's going on around us in terms of what's being presented to us? And finally, E, T-I-M-E, was it enriching? When it's all said and done, were you net positive after your time on the internet? Again, thank goodness for the internet. Thank goodness for all this wonderful technology. An app that allows you to track fires and see if they're nearby where you are in Australia. So we love the this technology. It's fabulous, but it was said in 1921 by Lang, who won the Nobel Prize, that technology is a useful servant, but a dangerous master. And that was back in 1921. I think it's really instructive today to consider those words. Yes, use technology. It's wonderful, but it can get the better of you. And clearly it's designed to get the better of you, to hack into your attention and to ultimately make you feel somewhat inadequate, while at the same time providing you a very quick fix for these perceived inadequacies.
And it's amazing that there was so much wisdom way back then. But as you say, it's designed to pull us in and to hook us in. And you actually, I love that you have this time method, and I love all the practical solutions that you offer in the book, because it's good to read the stats. It's good to read, what this is doing, but to actually have some ways that we can change it. And yes, I agree. Technology is amazing. I remember studying at university and having to go to the library and look up, books, and having the encyclopedia, and now we've got access.
Catalog, the Dewey Decimal System. Heck yeah.
We've got so much, but we just need to use it well and not let it just.
Well, I think it's important. We should use it, but not be used by it. Our attention on the internet is sold to the highest bidder, and it is manipulated without any interest in our well-being, by and large. So I think it's really fundamental. What we did, as you know, at the beginning of the book, is we called it out. And that in and of itself, I think, is very empowering. People kind of have a sense that, well, I spend too much time on the internet. It's probably not doing me a lot of good. But we called it out, as you rightly indicated, with the science, with the statistics that indicate how pervasive this is, how threatening it is. And then later in the book, talk about, then what can you do about it? Now that you know it's going on, how do you unravel that? And how do you put this knowledge to work for you so you can have a better experience? You can rewire your brain to be more forward thinking, to be more empathetic, to be more caring of others, and a brain that is going to allow you to make more thoughtful decisions.
So the other thing that you write about, which I think is very useful for awareness, is that this can actually cause structural changes in the brain. Tell us a little bit about what you've discovered when you were writing the section.
The brain is very plastic, means it molds itself based upon our experiences. We call this neuroplasticity. One of the fathers of neuroplasticity, Dr. Michael Merzenich, is a terrific researcher. We recently had the opportunity to interview him. And we know that the more you do something, the more the brain wires to adapt to that activity, especially if it's an activity that you pay attention to. If you choose to act impulsively and engage yourself in exposure to things that are fear-provoking, you will build a brain that sees the world from a fearful place. Similarly, if you choose to turn that stuff off and engage things like meditation, then through neuroplasticity, you're able to enhance your connection to the prefrontal cortex. You're able to enhance your connection, which means offset what we called earlier disconnection syndrome. We know, for example, that children and adolescents who spend an awful lot of time on social media have been demonstrated to actually have shrinkage in the corpus callosum. That's a very wide pathway, white matter pathway that connects the right and left hemispheres to each other. So there are visible structural changes that take place in the brains of individuals who ultimately spend a lot of time on the internet, spend a lot of time on social media. We know that individuals who engage in meditation, for example, have thicker prefrontal cortex, have a smaller amygdala, a less active amygdala, or an area of the brain that plays a role in impulsivity and fear. So, you know, the notion of our brains being static, that we got this brain and by about 18 years of age, that was as good as it gets, and it's all downhill from there. As you and I have talked about before, that is not the case. We grow new brain cells and we make much better connections if we want to, based on making good choices. And that moves forward, enhances our ability to further make good choices. On the other hand, when we choose poorly, when we choose to stay up late at night, not get enough restorative sleep, we have immediate changes in our brain's activity the following day. Amygdala activity, the area that we talk about that has a role to play in impulsivity and decisions that aren't thought through, is significantly increased. In one study, by as much as 60% from just a single night of non-restorative sleep. So our brains dramatically respond moment to moment based upon what we choose to do with ourselves in terms of lifestyle. So it becomes really important now to consider things like our diets and sleep and exercise and nature exposure and meditation, because now we understand they play such an important role in how we see the world around us, how we see our neighbors, how we see people who may have opinions that may be different from our own. We need to embrace those opinions and be with those opinions. That's how we can move forward and live together.
I love it. Now, one of my favorite parts of the book is the chapter on nature. Nature is my thing, and I love how you took such a deep dive into nature and shared so much about the impacts that it can have. And I'd love you to just share some of those impacts that you share in that chapter.
Well, you know, our job, I think, was to tell people what they already knew, but give them the science. And that is, we all know that when we're out in nature, we're going to feel better. That's why we do it, because it's self-serving. We love being in nature. We love the walks. We love the smells. We love the animals. We love the contact. And we all feel better when we've gotten back from that walk or whatever it may be. Well, it turns out there is robust science behind that, indicating that there are significant changes that happen when we are exposed to nature in the activity of various areas of the brain, in the functionality of our immune systems, and our level of stress, in the measurements of inflammation markers and stress markers like cortisol. These things have all been well described by very good science, most of which is continuing to take place in Japan. Japanese researchers talk about shirin-yoku, which means forest bathing, and are looking at the actual prescription of getting out into nature as an intervention to help people feel better. So we know that these things all feed into each other, that ultimately getting into nature or getting better sleep or eating more appropriately or starting an exercise program are all ways to reconnect to the prefrontal cortex and then allow us to be a little bit enhanced in our ability then to make better decisions and then bring on board the other players that we may not have engaged at the beginning of the program. So what I'm saying is it doesn't matter where you jump on the carousel, whether it's sleep, exercise, getting into nature, changing your diet, building relationships, meditation, whatever it may be, any one of those to start off with is going to make it far more likely then, moving forward, that you're going to engage the rest of the program and then really hit the home run that you've been waiting for.
Yes, and you're right. Just pick one of them and focus on that, and then pick another one. But I wanted to just go back to the nature one, because one quote you had here was astounding to me. You said Americans spend a remarkable 87% of their days indoors.
And
I did
another
not know
6%
that.
in their cars.
Yeah, that's
That
just
is,
amazing.
it is breathtaking. As we said in the book, basically, humans have become an indoor species, and it is, we've never existed apart from nature. You know, Chief Seattle said that man did not weave the web of life, he's only a strand of it. I think, to be appropriate, he or she is only a strand of it. Meaning we're intimately connected with nature. And it's been, you know, it is a bi-directional relationship. We affect nature and nature affects us, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But what the science is showing us, and what we talk about in that chapter, is the fact that it doesn't necessarily mean 4 weeks of camping in Yellowstone Park or a national park. It can be as simple as putting a plant in your kitchen, place of work, or bedroom, or even a photograph of a natural environment has been shown to be effective in helping, for example, reduce stress. So whatever we can do to reconnect to nature is going to turn out to be very positive for us. Again, Japanese researchers seem to be so far ahead in this, you know, and here it is a very simple thing to implement. And I think it's why more and more as we move forward, we see big companies incorporating natural elements into their lobbies, into their workplaces, because I think, you know, they're getting the message that their workers are going to be more productive and probably less likely to be sick.
Yes, yeah, it definitely is the case. And I really appreciate that you share all the science, because there is so much science about around this. I learned so much, and I'm really into nature, and I talk about it a lot. One of the papers that you wrote about that I thought was fascinating is view through a window may influence recovery from surgery. And I thought that was amazing. So what an impact this can have for recovery.
It was a very compelling study, and that was really one of the powerful entry points, I think, into this science. One of the early studies that demonstrated that the recovery time, the amount of pain medication that was required in patients who had undergone an appendectomy, had their appendix removed, was significantly lower in those patients who had a view to the outside versus those whose window simply looked onto a wall of the next building. So why then wouldn't you construct recovery areas or you know, rooms in hospitals to have more nature? You know, in years ago, we were never allowed to have. We told our patients, you're not allowed to have any plants or flowers in your room. You know, well-wishers would bring our patients flowers to put in their room to cheer them up, but we had the fear that they would carry one germ or another, and so that was not allowed. And you know, it turns out that that is a powerful healing intervention, and we need more of it.
It's amazing. It was so fascinating to read that research, because I can picture me arriving at a hotel in Chicago for a conference and being put on the 3rd floor looking out into this concrete wasteland of air conditioners and being told, no, I want to be moved to a room on the top floor where I can look out and have a view. So there's, you know, when you traveling and you need that nature look, you know, to see that there's research behind it is very enlightening. So I really appreciate how you have shared so much research in this book.
Let me take this just a little bit further, because there was another interesting study that we looked at. This is a study that did functional MRI on individuals, and it did so, and after they had looked either at a neutral image, an urban environment picture, or a picture image of nature. And what this study looked at that was really quite interesting is a technique that's used by research scientists called delayed discounting. And it's basically a measurement of impulsivity. And what they found, interestingly, was that impulsivity was much higher in individuals who simply were shown a picture of an urban environment and then were quizzed 10 seconds later, versus those who were shown an image of a natural environment. And so they use this technique called delayed discounting, which means you want $10 now or $100 now. Well, everybody says, I'll take the $100 now. Okay. You want $10 now or $100 in a week? Well, almost everybody says, fine, I'll wait the week for the $100. But when you take it out further, 3 weeks, 5 weeks, a month, a year, that's when you can start to see impulsivity versus making a long-term decision. And it's interesting that those people who are simply shown an image of an urban environment were far more likely at, the further months out to say, no, I'll take the $10, I'm out of here. I'm not waiting around that length of time for the $100, versus people who simply looked at a picture of a natural environment. And they were much more likely to say, yeah, I'll wait around another month or two, whatever it takes for the $100. And interestingly, you'll definitely get a kick out of this. The same results were seen based upon hemoglobin A1C. They did the same type of testing, delayed discounting. They found that those individuals, diabetics, who had a lower A1C were far less likely to be impulsive and far more likely to say they would wait more months for the higher remuneration, the higher money, in comparison to those whose A1Cs were elevated. Now, what does it mean? There's all kinds of things you could read into that. The higher blood sugar could have a direct effect on brain wiring, or secondarily through inflammation, challenging the connection between the prefrontal cortex and other brain areas. But it's really, really interesting in our world of growing rates of type 2 diabetes, inflammation, and obvious impulsivity, and us versus them mentality. Things are starting to come together in a picture that becomes very understandable, and even beyond that, that offers us up some tools moving forward, so we might be able to change a little bit this kind of strange mentality of people around the world these days.
I love it. Really, really great. And as well as the nature chapter, you time, and then you have a 10-day process on how to implement all of this, which I think is perfect. We want to hear the science, we want to be aware of what's causing problems, but to have a way to actually make these changes and then start to see results, I think is fantastic. And you've done an excellent job with that.
That was exactly the method here. The method was to present the problem and then present the solution. The problem being that the world is rewiring our brains, and by and large, it's not a good thing. The solution is, okay, recognize that is happening, A, and B, here's how you can change your lifestyle choices to offset that. But being aware, I think, is hugely important. So you're right, that's what we try to do. That's what the 10-day plan is all about. And anything that's going to help people regain even a small ability to make better decisions, we believe is really very, very important.
Absolutely. And then, of course, as a nutritionist, you've got a whole chapter on food and a whole section of recipes as well. So you've covered everything, which I think is fantastic.
I sure tried.
Yes, absolutely. And the cauliflower pancakes look absolutely amazing. And I'm going to be trying that one out. And I'd love to be able to share that recipe with my community as well, if that's okay.
It's totally wonderful. Who knew the lowly cauliflower could get such play as we move forward, and you can make rice out of it. You can make all kinds of things, mashed potatoes like. So we're really, and it's a cruciferous vegetable. My goodness, what more do you want in life? I guess you want more than a cauliflower, that's for sure. But my favorite, I think one of my favorites for people who have the book, is the jicama slaw. I always love coleslaw for whatever reason. I think it reminded me of being at a picnic or something. But if you use jicama, plus that recipe has extra virgin olive oil, if you use jicama, you're really giving yourself a lot of prebiotic fiber, nurturing your gut bacteria, helping to reduce inflammation, and all the good things that the gut bacteria do.
What a beautiful, comprehensive book, Dr. Perlmutter. I want to say again, congratulations, and thank you for being with us today to give us some highlights, and I look forward to sharing this with my community.
Thank you very much.